My name is James Callahan, but everyone who ever mattered to me called me Jack. I was born in the spring of 1923 in a small town called Millbrook, just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father worked the steel mills until the smoke and heat took his lungs, and my mother raised 5 children on prayers and vegetable soup. I was the middle child, the quiet one, the boy who spent his evenings reading adventure novels by candlelight and dreaming of a world beyond the smokestacks and the endless grey skies of industrial America. I'm telling you this story today because I'm 93 years old and the doctors say my heart is tired. They're right. It's been tired for a long time, carrying the weight of memories that never fade, no matter how many decades pass. And there's one story I've never told anyone. Not my wife before she passed, not my children, not my grandchildren. It's a story about war, about orders, about the moment I learned that obeying can kill just as surely as a bullet. Before I continue, if you're finding value in these stories, in these memories of an old soldier who just wants the truth to be known before he's gone, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. It helps more people hear these stories, and maybe, just maybe, it helps us remember why we should never let history repeat itself. I was 19 years old when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I remember exactly where I was, sitting in my father's old armchair, listening to the radio with my younger brother Tommy. The announcer's voice cracked as he described the devastation, the ships burning, the men dying. Tommy looked at me with those big brown eyes of his, and he asked me if we were going to war. I told him yes. I didn't know then that I was sealing both our fates with that single word. 3 months later, Tommy and I stood in line at the recruitment office downtown. Tommy was only 17, but he lied about his age, and the recruiter didn't ask too many questions. They needed bodies, you see. That's what we were to them, bodies to throw at the enemy. But we didn't know that yet. We were young and stupid and full of the kind of patriotism they sell you in newsreels and comic books. We thought we were heroes. We thought we were invincible. Basic training was at Camp Wheeler in Georgia. The heat there was like nothing I'd ever experienced, thick and wet and suffocating. They shaved our heads and gave us uniforms that didn't fit and rifles that were older than we were. Our drill sergeant was a man named Sergeant Patterson, a thick-necked veteran of the Great War who had a voice like gravel and a heart like stone. He told us on the first day that half of us wouldn't make it home. He told us that the only way to survive was to follow orders, no questions asked. Obey, he said. Obey and you live. Disobey and you die. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. Tommy and I were assigned to the same company, thank the Lord. We looked out for each other during those brutal weeks of training, sharing our rations when one of us was too tired to eat, taking turns staying awake during night watches so the other could rest. The other boys in our platoon were just like us. Factory workers and farm boys and college dropouts, all of them scared, all of them pretending not to be. There was Billy Morrison from Oklahoma, who had a wife and a baby daughter he'd never met. There was Vincent Caruso from Brooklyn, who talked tough but cried in his sleep. There was Daniel Whitfield from Maine, a preacher's son who read his Bible every night and prayed for all our souls. We became brothers, the 6 of us. We made a pact that we'd all make it home together. We were fools, but we were hopeful fools, and sometimes that's all you have in war. In the summer of 1943, we shipped out to England. The crossing took 2 weeks, and I spent most of it leaning over the railing, seasick and terrified. Tommy sat beside me, rubbing my back and telling me jokes to keep my mind off the churning waves and the submarines that lurked beneath them. He was always the brave one, my brother. He had a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that made you forget there was a war on. I envied him that. I was always the worrier, the one who lay awake at night imagining all the ways things could go wrong. England was cold and wet and grey, but it was also alive in a way I hadn't expected. The people there had been living under the threat of German bombs for years, but they hadn't given up. They still sang in the pubs and danced in the streets and fell in love like the world wasn't ending. I met a girl there, a nurse named Margaret, who had red hair and freckles and a laugh that reminded me of home. We only had 3 weeks together before I shipped out again. But those 3 weeks changed something in me. She made me want to survive. Not for my country or my brothers in arms, but for the simple possibility of seeing her again. On June 6, 1944, we landed on the beaches of Normandy. I don't have words to describe that day. I've tried for 70 years, and I still can't find them. The noise, the chaos, the blood, the water turning red around us as men fell before they even reached the shore, the sand beneath my feet that felt like quicksand, pulling me down, trying to swallow me whole. I saw boys I'd trained with, boys I'd shared meals with, boys I'd called friends, lying face down in the surf, their eyes open and empty. Tommy grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "Move!" he shouted. "Move or die, Jack!" So I moved. I ran across that beach with bullets singing past my ears and explosions shaking the ground beneath my feet. I didn't think. I just obeyed. Move forward, take cover, move forward again. Follow orders. Don't think, don't feel, just obey. We lost Billy Morrison that day. He took a bullet to the chest not 20 feet from the seawall. I saw him fall, saw the surprise on his face, like he couldn't believe this was really happening. I wanted to stop, to go back for him, but Sergeant Patterson was screaming at us to keep moving, and so I did. I left Billy lying there in the sand alone, dying, and I kept moving because that's what I was ordered to do. That night, huddled in a foxhole with Tommy and Vincent and Daniel, I cried for the first time since I was a child. Tommy held me and told me it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done, that Billy would have wanted us to keep fighting. But even then, something was breaking inside me. Something was starting to question the doctrine of obedience that had been drilled into us since the first day of basic training. The weeks that followed were a blur of combat and exhaustion and grief. We pushed inland, fighting through hedgerows that had been turned into fortresses, through villages that had been reduced to rubble, through fields that were littered with the bodies of soldiers from both sides. I killed men during those weeks. German soldiers, young like me, scared like me, following orders like me. I didn't hate them. I couldn't. They were just boys doing what they were told, same as us. Our commanding officer was a man named Captain Harold Brennan. He was 32 years old, a West Point graduate from Virginia who had never seen combat before Normandy. He was tall and handsome and spoke with the kind of confident authority that made you want to trust him. But there was something in his eyes that worried me, a rigidity, a coldness, an inability to adapt to the chaos of war. He believed in orders the way Daniel believed in God, absolutely, unquestioningly, completely. It was late July when we received our orders to take a small village called Sainte Marguerite. Intelligence reported that a German communication outpost was located there, and command wanted it captured intact. Captain Brennan gathered us together and laid out the plan. We would approach from the east at dawn, move through the village in a standard clearing pattern, and secure the church at the center of town, where the outpost was believed to be located. There were 23 of us left in the company by then. 23 out of the original 60 who had landed on that beach 7 weeks earlier. We were exhausted and hungry and running low on ammunition. But orders were orders, and so we prepared for the assault. That night, a French resistance fighter named Henri came to our camp. He was a small man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He asked to speak with Captain Brennan, and I was close enough to overhear their conversation. "The Germans have reinforced the village," Henri said in broken English. "Many soldiers, tanks. They know you are coming." Captain Brennan dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "Our intelligence says otherwise," he replied. "We proceed as planned." Henri grabbed the captain's arm, desperate. "Please, monsieur, you will lose many men. The approach from the east is a trap. There is another way, through the woods to the north. It is longer, but safer." Brennan pulled his arm free. "I have my orders," he said. "The approach is from the east at dawn. That is the plan, and we will execute it." I watched Henri's face fall, watched the hope drain out of his eyes, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I approached him after Brennan walked away. "Is it true?" I asked. "About the reinforcements?" Henri looked at me with such sadness. "Yes," he said. "They are waiting for you. They know the plan. Someone has betrayed you. Please tell your captain. Make him listen." I tried. God knows I tried. I went to Brennan's tent that night and told him what Henri had said. I suggested that we at least send a reconnaissance team to verify the intelligence before committing to the full assault. I practically begged him to consider the alternative route. Brennan looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his boot. "Private Callahan," he said, his voice as cold as January ice. "You have your orders. You will follow them. Is that understood?" "Sir, with respect, if the intelligence is wrong." "Is that understood, Private?" I stood there looking into those rigid, unyielding eyes, and I felt the weight of my entire military training pressing down on me. "Obey," Sergeant Patterson had said. "Obey and you live. Disobey and you die." "Yes, sir," I said. "Understood." I walked back to my foxhole and sat there in the darkness, sick with dread. Tommy was already asleep, his face peaceful, his breathing slow and steady. I wanted to wake him, to tell him what I'd learned, to warn him. But what could I say? We had our orders. There was nothing to be done. Or was there? I lay awake all night, wrestling with a question that I'd never allowed myself to ask before. What if the orders were wrong? What if following them meant walking into a massacre? Did obedience still matter when it led to certain death? Dawn came too quickly. We assembled in formation, checked our weapons, said our prayers. Daniel led us in a quiet recitation of the 23rd Psalm, his voice steady, even though his hands were shaking. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." I feared evil that morning. I feared it more than I'd ever feared anything in my life. We moved out. 23 men walking single file toward Sainte Marguerite, toward our orders, toward our fate. The morning mist clung to the fields, making it impossible to see more than 50 feet in any direction. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every step felt like a step closer to the grave. We were maybe half a mile from the village when I heard it. The distinctive sound of a German tank engine. Then another. Then the chatter of machine guns being readied. Tommy heard it too. He looked back at me, his eyes wide. "Jack," he whispered, "they're waiting for us." In that moment, everything Henri had said came flooding back. "They know you are coming. The approach from the east is a trap. Please, make him listen." But Brennan hadn't listened, and now we were walking into the jaws of death because of orders that were based on faulty intelligence, orders that hadn't been questioned, orders that had been followed without thought or adaptation. I made a decision then, the hardest decision of my life. I grabbed Tommy's arm and pulled him down into a ditch beside the road. "Get down," I hissed. "Everyone get down." A few of the men followed my lead, diving for cover, but most of them kept walking, too disciplined, too well-trained, too obedient to deviate from their orders. Captain Brennan turned around, his face twisted with fury. "Private Callahan, what the hell do you think you're doing? Get back in formation." Before I could answer, the world exploded. The Germans opened fire from 3 positions, machine guns and mortars and tank shells all raining down on us at once. The men who had kept walking were cut down in seconds, their bodies torn apart by the barrage. I saw Vincent take a bullet to the head. I saw Daniel stumble and fall, his Bible flying from his hands. I saw Captain Brennan disappear in a cloud of smoke and fire. Tommy and I and 4 other men who had followed me into the ditch pressed ourselves into the mud, trying to make ourselves as small as possible while the battle raged above us. The noise was deafening, the ground shaking beneath us with every explosion. I could hear men screaming, dying, begging for help that would never come. I don't know how long we lay there. It could have been minutes or hours. Time loses all meaning in combat, but eventually the firing stopped. The Germans must have thought they'd killed us all. I heard their voices, distant and triumphant, as they moved through the field, checking bodies, collecting weapons. We waited until nightfall. Then, inch by inch, we crawled out of that ditch and made our way north through the woods, following the route Henri had tried to tell us about. It took us 6 hours to circle around the village and reach our lines. 6 hours of crawling through mud and brush, terrified that at any moment we'd be discovered and shot. When we finally made it back to camp, there were only 6 of us left. 6 out of 23. 17 men dead because of orders that should have been questioned, intelligence that should have been verified, a plan that should have been changed. I was arrested when I reached camp, charged with disobedience, with abandoning my post, with causing the deaths of my fellow soldiers by breaking formation. They threw me in a makeshift stockade and told me I'd be court-martialed. Tommy came to see me that night. He reached through the bars and grabbed my hand, his grip tight and fierce. "You saved my life, Jack," he said. "You saved all of us who listened to you." I couldn't speak. The guilt was too heavy, the grief too raw. 17 men were dead. Daniel was dead. Vincent was dead. And some part of me couldn't help but wonder if I'd spoken up sooner. If I'd refused to follow those orders from the beginning, could I have saved more of them? The court-martial never happened. 2 days after my arrest, a colonel from headquarters arrived at our camp. His name was Colonel Robert Mitchell, and he'd been sent to investigate the disaster at Sainte Marguerite. He interviewed the survivors, reviewed the intelligence reports, and examined the evidence. And what he found made the charges against me disappear. The intelligence had been compromised. A German spy had fed false information to our command, leading them to believe the village was lightly defended when in fact it was a fortified trap. Captain Brennan had been warned by Henri, had been given the chance to adapt his plan, and had refused because his orders didn't allow for deviation. Colonel Mitchell came to see me in the stockade before he left. He was an older man, maybe 50, with grey hair and kind eyes, and the weary look of someone who had seen too much of war. "Private Callahan," he said, "I've reviewed the situation. You acted against orders, and under normal circumstances that would be grounds for severe punishment. But these weren't normal circumstances. You assessed the situation, recognized the danger, and made a decision that saved lives. 6 men are alive because of what you did." I looked at him, not sure what to say. "Is that supposed to make me feel better, sir?" 17 men are dead," Mitchell nodded slowly. "Yes, they are, and their deaths are a tragedy. But war is full of tragedies, Private. What matters is how we respond to them. Captain Brennan followed his orders without question, and it cost him his life and the lives of his men. You questioned those orders, and you saved the men who had the courage to question them with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "I'm recommending that the charges against you be dropped," he said, "and I'm recommending you for promotion. The army needs men who can think, Private. Men who understand that orders are not scripture, that the map is not the territory, that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is say no." I was released that afternoon. Tommy was waiting for me outside the stockade, that same bright smile on his face, that same light in his eyes. "We're still alive, Jack," he said. "We made it." I hugged him then, held him tight, felt his heart beating against my chest. He was right. We were alive. But I was not the same man who had walked into that stockade. Something had changed in me, something fundamental and permanent. The war went on for another year. Tommy and I fought through France and Belgium and into Germany itself. We saw horrors that I won't describe here, things that would give you nightmares, things that I still see when I close my eyes at night. But we also saw moments of incredible humanity. Soldiers sharing their rations with starving civilians, medics risking their lives to save wounded enemies, men finding ways to be kind even in the midst of unspeakable cruelty. I learned something during that year, something that has stayed with me ever since. Following orders is not the same as doing right. Obedience is not the same as courage. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is question, is think, is refuse to be a blind instrument of someone else's will. The men who died at Sainte Marguerite didn't die because they were cowards. They died because they were trained to obey without thinking, and their training got them killed. Captain Brennan wasn't a bad man. He was a product of his training, just like the rest of us. He believed that discipline and order were the keys to victory, and in many ways, he was right. An army can't function without obedience, but obedience has its limits. When orders conflict with reality, when following them means certain death, when the evidence in front of your eyes contradicts the words on a piece of paper, that's when a soldier must become something more than a soldier. That's when he must become a thinking human being. The war ended in May of 1945. Tommy and I were in a small town in Bavaria when we heard the news. We hugged each other and cried and laughed and danced with the other soldiers, all of us drunk on relief and joy and the simple miracle of being alive. We came home that summer. Tommy went back to Pennsylvania and married his high school sweetheart, a girl named Sarah who had waited for him all through the war. They had 4 children together and grew old on a small farm outside of Pittsburgh. He passed away in 1998, surrounded by his family, peaceful and content. I went back to England first. I had to find Margaret, the nurse with the red hair and the laugh that reminded me of home. It took me 3 weeks to track her down. She was working at a hospital in London, caring for soldiers who had been wounded in the final days of the war. When she saw me standing in the doorway of her ward, she dropped the tray she was carrying and ran into my arms. We got married that December in a small church in the English countryside. It was snowing, and Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, and I wore my army uniform because it was the only nice thing I owned. We moved back to America the following spring and settled in Ohio, where I found work as a teacher. History, ironically enough. I spent the next 40 years trying to help young people understand the past, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could learn from it. Margaret passed in 2008, pancreatic cancer. She went quickly, which was a mercy, but losing her was like losing a part of myself. We had 53 years together, raised 3 children, welcomed 8 grandchildren into the world. She was my anchor, my compass, my reason for living. After she was gone, the memories of the war came flooding back, stronger than ever. I'm 93 years old now, and I've been thinking a lot about Sainte Marguerite, about the 23 men who walked into that trap, and the 6 who walked out. About Captain Brennan, who couldn't bend, and Colonel Mitchell, who helped me understand that bending isn't the same as breaking. About the 17 men who died because they did what they were told, and the 6 who lived because one of them didn't. I'm not proud of disobeying orders. I'm not proud of breaking ranks when my brothers needed me to stand with them. But I'm not ashamed of it either. I made a choice in that moment, a choice that saved lives, including my own. I don't know if it was the right choice. I don't know if any choice can be called right when 17 men die, but I know that blind obedience would have killed me too, and it would have killed Tommy, and the 4 other men who had the courage to listen to their instincts instead of their training. War is chaos. It's noise and blood and fear and confusion, and in the middle of all that chaos, you have to find something to hold on to, something that tells you who you are and what you stand for. For some men, that something is duty. For others, it's faith. For me, it was the simple, stubborn belief that I was more than a cog in a machine, more than a body to be thrown at the enemy, more than an instrument of someone else's will. I was a man. A thinking, feeling, choosing man. And when the orders were wrong, when following them meant certain death, I chose to think. I chose to feel. I chose to live. That's the lesson I want to leave you with. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this, don't be a blind follower. Don't surrender your judgment to someone else just because they have more stripes on their sleeve or more stars on their shoulder. Think, question, evaluate. And when the evidence in front of your eyes tells you that the orders are wrong, have the courage to say so. In battle, I learned that obeying can kill too. It's a hard lesson, bought with blood and grief and 17 lives that ended too soon. But it's a lesson worth learning, worth remembering, worth passing on. My name is James Callahan, but everyone who ever mattered to me called me Jack. I was born in the spring of 1923, and I have lived a long, full life. I've loved and lost and laughed and cried. I've seen the best of humanity and the worst. And now, at the end of my days, I'm telling you this story because I want you to know the truth. Obedience is not always a virtue, and sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse to follow orders. Thank you for listening to an old man's memories. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. And if you take nothing else from what I've told you today, take this. Think for yourself. Question everything. And never ever let anyone convince you that following orders is more important than doing what's right. I started this story by telling you about a small town called Millbrook, about a boy who dreamed of adventure and found war instead. Now I want to tell you about what happened after the war, about the years that followed, about the weight of memory and the long, slow work of healing. When I came home in 1945, I was 22 years old, and I felt like an old man. I had seen things that no human being should ever see, done things that I would never be able to undo. The nightmares started almost immediately. Vivid, terrible dreams of Normandy and Sainte Marguerite and all the nameless battles in between. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced that I was still there, still fighting, still watching my friends die. Margaret saved me. She was the only one who understood, the only one who didn't try to tell me to forget, to move on, to put it all behind me. She knew that you can't put something like that behind you. It becomes part of you, woven into your bones and blood, present in every breath you take. The best you can hope for is to learn to live with it, to carry it without letting it crush you. We talked about the war often, Margaret and I. Not the glory of it, not the heroism, but the truth of it, the mud and the blood and the fear and the grief. She listened without judgment, without platitudes, without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. She just listened, and that was enough. It was more than enough. I also found solace in the men who had survived with me. The 5 other men who had followed me into that ditch at Sainte Marguerite, who had crawled through the woods with me, who had made it back alive. We stayed in touch for the rest of our lives. We wrote letters and made phone calls and gathered together once a year, every year, on the anniversary of that terrible day. There was Private First Class Michael O'Brien from Boston, who had been a dock worker before the war. He went back to the docks afterward, worked there for 30 years, raised a family of 8 children in a cramped apartment in South Boston. He was a hard man, tough as nails, but he cried every time we gathered, cried for the men we'd lost and the boys we'd been. There was Corporal James Earl Washington from Alabama, one of the few black soldiers in our company. He had faced discrimination and prejudice throughout his service, treated as less than by the same country he was risking his life to defend. After the war, he became a civil rights activist, fighting for the equality that had been denied to him in uniform. He marched with King in Selma, sat in at lunch counters, registered voters in counties where such work could get you killed. He told me once that the courage he'd found in that ditch at Sainte Marguerite was the same courage that carried him through the struggle for freedom. There was Private Robert Kowalski from Chicago, the son of Polish immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. He became a carpenter after the war, built houses and churches and schools with his own two hands. He said that creating things helped balance out all the destruction he'd witnessed. Every nail he drove was a small act of defiance against the chaos of war. There was Private Thomas Lawson from Tennessee, a quiet man who had grown up on a farm and went back to farming after the war. He never talked much about what we'd been through, but every year, on the anniversary, he would bring flowers to place at the memorial we'd built in Daniel's honor. Daniel, the preacher's son, who had read his Bible every night and prayed for all our souls. Daniel, who had died with that Bible in his hands. And there was Tommy, my brother, my best friend, the bravest man I ever knew. Tommy, who had lied about his age to join me in the fight. Tommy, who had pulled me across the beach at Normandy. Tommy, who had followed me into that ditch without hesitation, without question, trusting me with his life. We didn't talk about that moment often, Tommy and I. We didn't need to. It was always there between us, an unspoken bond that went deeper than words. He had trusted me, and I had saved him, and that was enough. That was everything. The years passed. Decades. The world changed around us, and we changed with it. The young soldiers who had stormed the beaches of Normandy became middle-aged men with mortgages and jobs and children of their own. Then we became old men, grey-haired and slow-moving, watching our grandchildren grow up in a world so different from the one we'd fought for that sometimes it felt like science fiction. I taught history for 40 years, as I mentioned. American history, world history, the history of war and peace and everything in between. I tried to teach my students the truth, not the sanitized version they got in textbooks, but the real, messy, complicated truth. I told them about the courage and the cowardice, the heroism and the horror, the moments of impossible beauty and the moments of unspeakable cruelty. I also told them about Sainte Marguerite, about the 23 men and the 6 survivors, about Captain Brennan and Colonel Mitchell, about the decision I made in that ditch, the decision that haunted me and saved me in equal measure. The lesson I tried to teach them was this: obedience has its place, but so does conscience. Discipline has its value, but so does independent thought. The greatest atrocities in human history were committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who were just following orders. The guards at the concentration camps were following orders. The soldiers who massacred civilians at My Lai were following orders. The men who carried out the firebombing of Dresden and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima were following orders. I'm not saying those men were evil. Most of them were probably decent people who loved their families and went to church and tried to live good lives. But they surrendered their judgment to someone else, and in doing so, they became instruments of terrible destruction. They traded their humanity for obedience, and the world paid the price. I want to tell you about something that happened in 1963, almost 20 years after the war ended. I was 40 years old, teaching at a high school in Columbus, Ohio. One of my students, a boy named David, came to me after class one day with a question. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice hesitant, "my father was in the war. He doesn't talk about it much, but sometimes he has nightmares. He wakes up screaming, and my mother can't calm him down. I don't know what to do." I looked at that boy, at his worried face, at his eyes that were too old for his years, and I saw myself. I saw the boy I had been before the war, the one who didn't understand what his father had been through, the one who didn't know how to bridge the gap between the world of combat and the world of peace. I told David to be patient, to be present, to listen without judgment and love without condition. I told him that his father was carrying a weight that no one who hasn't been to war can fully understand, but that didn't mean he had to carry it alone. I told him that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who's suffering is simply to be there, to let them know that they're not alone, that someone cares. David thanked me and left, and I sat in my empty classroom for a long time, thinking about all the fathers who had come home from that war carrying invisible wounds, thinking about all the families who had been shaped by trauma they couldn't name, thinking about the long, long shadow that war casts over generations. A few years later, the Vietnam War began to escalate. I watched the news with growing horror as young men, boys really, were sent to fight in a conflict that many of them didn't understand, for reasons that many Americans couldn't articulate. The protests grew, and the body counts grew, and the country tore itself apart over a war that seemed to have no end and no purpose. I was against the war. I make no apologies for that. I'd seen enough of combat to know its true cost, and I couldn't watch another generation of young men be sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. But I also understood the soldiers who were fighting it. They were just like me and Tommy and Billy and Vincent and Daniel. They were young and scared and doing what they were told, and they deserved better than to be spat on when they came home. I remember one night in 1970 when a former student of mine came to see me. His name was Michael, and he had been drafted right out of high school. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, seen things that he couldn't talk about, lost friends in ways that he couldn't forget. He sat in my living room, his hands shaking, his eyes hollow, and he asked me how I had survived. "How did you do it, Mr. Callahan? How did you come back from the war and live a normal life? How did you make it stop hurting?" I looked at him, at this broken boy who reminded me so much of myself, and I told him the truth. "It doesn't stop hurting," I said. "Not completely, not ever. But you learn to live with the hurt. You find things that matter, people who matter, reasons to keep going. You build a life day by day, brick by brick, and you don't let the darkness swallow you whole." I also told him about Sainte Marguerite, about the decision I made, the orders I disobeyed, the men who lived and the men who died. I told him that he wasn't responsible for the decisions of his commanders, that the weight of the war wasn't his to carry alone, that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is question. Michael stayed with us that night. Margaret made him dinner and gave him a warm bed, and in the morning he left with a card for a veterans support group and a promise to stay in touch. He kept that promise. He went on to become a counselor himself, helping other veterans navigate the difficult transition from combat to civilian life. Last I heard, he was still doing that work, still helping, still healing. The men I served with at Sainte Marguerite started dying in the 1990s. Michael O'Brien went first, a heart attack in 1992. James Earl Washington followed in 95, cancer. Robert Kowalski passed in 97, a stroke. Tommy was next, in 98, peaceful in his sleep, surrounded by family. I spoke at Tommy's funeral. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, harder even than storming that beach at Normandy. I stood at the pulpit of the church where he'd been baptized and married and eulogized, and I tried to put into words what he had meant to me. "Tommy was my brother," I said, "not just by blood, but by choice. He was the bravest man I ever knew, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was afraid, and he kept going anyway. He trusted me with his life, and I will be grateful for that trust until the day I die." I told them about the ditch at Sainte Marguerite, about the moment I grabbed his arm and pulled him down, about the 17 men who died and the 6 who lived. I told them that Tommy was alive for 53 more years because he chose to trust his brother instead of his orders. Some people in that church understood. They nodded and wiped their eyes and came up to me afterward to shake my hand, but some of them looked at me with confusion, or worse, with disapproval. They didn't understand how disobeying orders could be a good thing. They didn't understand how the chaos of war could make the rules of peace meaningless. I don't blame them for not understanding. How could they? They hadn't been there. They hadn't seen what I'd seen, done what I'd done, lost what I'd lost. The gap between those who have experienced war and those who haven't is vast and unbridgeable. All you can do is try to build a small footbridge across it, one story at a time. Thomas Lawson, the farmer from Tennessee, passed in 2003. He went quietly, working in his fields until the day he couldn't anymore. His son told me that he'd been carrying Daniel's Bible with him for 60 years, keeping it safe, reading from it every night before bed. When Thomas died, they buried the Bible with him, finally reuniting it with its original owner. That left just me, the last survivor of the 6 who had crawled out of that ditch at Sainte Marguerite. The last man standing from a company of 60 who had landed on the beaches of Normandy. The last witness to a tragedy that the history books barely mention. I'm telling you this story because soon there will be no one left to tell it. The men who fought in World War II are dying, thousands of us every day, taking our memories with us into the grave. In a few more years, there won't be anyone left who remembers what it was like to storm those beaches, to fight through those hedgerows, to see friends cut down by bullets and shells and the endless grinding machinery of war. I want you to remember. Not the glory, not the heroism, not the sanitized version that makes war seem like an adventure. I want you to remember the truth, the mud and the blood and the fear. The young men dying far from home, calling out for their mothers with their last breath. The impossible choices that had to be made in the chaos of combat. The weight of obedience and the cost of blind loyalty. In battle, I learned that obeying can kill too. It's a hard lesson, but it's an important one. The men who died at Sainte Marguerite weren't weak or foolish or cowardly. They were well-trained soldiers who did exactly what they were supposed to do, and it got them killed. I'm not saying we should never follow orders. I'm not saying discipline and hierarchy have no value. An army can't function without obedience, and a society can't function without rules. But obedience must have limits. Discipline must be tempered by judgment. Rules must be questioned when they lead to injustice or destruction. The Nuremberg trials established a principle that I believe with all my heart. Following orders is not a defense for atrocity. If you participate in something monstrous, you are responsible, regardless of who told you to do it. Your humanity doesn't disappear just because someone with authority gave you a command. That principle applies in war, but it also applies in peace. Every day, we face moments where we must choose between obedience and conscience. Most of those moments are small. Do we go along with an unethical practice at work? Do we stay silent when someone tells a racist joke? Do we look the other way when we see someone being treated unfairly? But those small moments add up. They shape who we are and what kind of society we live in. I'm 93 years old, and I've seen it happen again. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine. The names change, the technologies change, the justifications change, but the fundamental tragedy remains the same. Young people dying far from home, families being destroyed, ordinary people being caught up in forces beyond their control. I don't have the answers. I don't know how to stop war, how to end conflict, how to make humanity finally learn from its mistakes. All I have is this story, these memories, this plea to whoever is listening. Think, question, decide for yourself what is right and what is wrong. And when the orders are wrong, have the courage to say no. My name is James Callahan, but everyone who ever mattered to me called me Jack. I was born in the spring of 1923, and I have tried to live my life with courage and kindness and conscience. I haven't always succeeded. I've made mistakes, hurt people, failed to live up to my own ideals. But I've tried. That's all any of us can do. In battle, I learned that obeying can kill too, but I also learned that thinking can save, that questioning can protect, that conscience can be a better guide than orders. Remember that. Please remember that. And thank you one last time for listening to an old man's story. There's one more story I want to tell you, one more memory that I've carried with me for all these years. It happened on the day we were liberated, the day the war finally ended, the day Tommy and I danced in the streets of that small Bavarian town. In the midst of all the celebration, I noticed an old German man sitting on a bench at the edge of the square. He was thin and frail, with white hair and tired eyes, and he was watching the American soldiers with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or resignation, or something else entirely. I walked over to him, driven by some impulse I couldn't name. He flinched when he saw me coming, raised his hands as if expecting a blow. But I just sat down beside him on the bench and offered him a cigarette. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. Then he took the cigarette and let me light it for him. We sat there in silence for a while, watching the celebration, listening to the music and the laughter. Finally, he spoke. English. Accented but understandable. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you kind to me? I am your enemy." I thought about the question for a long time before I answered. "Because the war is over," I said, "and because I'm tired of hating, and because you remind me of my father, who worked in a steel mill until the smoke and heat took his lungs, who never hurt anyone in his life, who just wanted to provide for his family and live in peace." The old man started to cry, silent tears running down his weathered cheeks. He told me that his son had been killed on the Eastern Front, that his daughter had died in the bombing of Dresden, that his wife had passed away from grief and starvation the previous winter. He was alone now, the last survivor of a family that had been destroyed by a war they never wanted. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry for your losses. I'm sorry for all of it." He took my hand and held it tight. "We are all sorry," he said. "But sorry is not enough. We must do better. We must be better. Or this will happen again and again and again until there is no one left. I've thought about that old man many times over the years. I never learned his name, never saw him again, never knew what happened to him. But his words have stayed with me, a constant reminder of what war really costs. Not just the soldiers who die on the battlefield, but the families who are torn apart, the communities that are destroyed, the ordinary people who are caught up in forces beyond their control. We must do better. We must be better, or this will happen again. I'm 93 years old and I've seen it happen again. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, Iraq. The names change, the technologies change, the justifications change. But the fundamental tragedy remains the same. Young people dying far from home, families being destroyed, ordinary people being caught up in forces beyond their control. I don't have the answers. I don't know how to stop war, how to end conflict, how to make humanity finally learn from its mistakes. All I have is this story, these memories, this plea to whoever is listening. Think. Question. Decide for yourself what is right and what is wrong. And when the orders are wrong, have the courage to say no. My name is James Callahan, but everyone who ever mattered to me called me Jack. I was born in the spring of 1923, and I have tried to live my life with courage and kindness and conscience. I haven't always succeeded. I've made mistakes, hurt people, failed to live up to my own ideals. But I've tried. That's all any of us can do. In battle, I learned that obeying can kill too, but I also learned that thinking can save, that questioning can protect, that conscience can be a better guide than orders. Remember that. Please, remember that. And thank you one last time for listening to an old man's story.